the podcast that explores the ideas, strategies, and innovations shaping the future of tech, markets, and growth. I'm Michaela Jacosberg-Reiss, I'm a product and growth strategist. And in this series, I sit down with industry leaders, visionaries, and innovators to uncover the key moments, bold moves, and big ideas driving what's next. Whether it's past lessons, current challenges, or future opportunities, we connect the dots to help you navigate what's ahead. So join me as we explore what's next and how we make it happen. So today I have the utmost pleasure of speaking with Irene and Pradip, co-founders of Eliza, an AI-powered platform empowering mental health care clinics to better address the needs of their patients and support the growth and well-being of their therapist. Eliza provides tools for easy, unobtrusive measurement-based care, allowing clinics to keep track of patients' progress, outcomes, greatly increasing the number of patients a clinic can effectively serve without increasing the burden on providers. And in this episodes, we are going to dive into real talk about what it takes to bring an idea from 0 to 1 and the risky choices they evaluate along the way, and some fun that happens with that. So first, Irene and Pradeep, can you give me a quick intro on your background, respective roles, and in the partnership, and how did Eliza take place?
Yeah, happy to kind of kick us off, and thanks for having us. Really appreciate being able to sit down with you here. Um, let's see. So I'm Pradeep. I'm the founder, the technical founder and CEO. And so my background is really in the space of all things data, so data science, ML, ML both on the infrastructure engineering side as well as modeling side. And so after I kind of like wrapped up my time at Twitter, I was kind of trying to understand what I wanted to do next. I definitely want to do something smaller, and so I was just looking at the areas that I'm passionate about. Technically, it's data science, ML. But I want to kind of work closer to customers, closer to users, and the mental health space was something that really resonated with me. Honestly, I think it's in working with my own therapist and maybe often reverse therapizing him that I caught on to that this is a space that is has a lot of tensions, has a lot of frictions for practitioners that kind of got me interested in the proto concept behind Eliza. Um, and yeah, and like I separately I had like met Irene and we had worked together at Twitter, and we kind of started chatting about this idea, started putting out some early concepts and kind of got going from there. That was kind of how at least my journey into Eliza came in. Prior to this, I mean, well, a long time ago, I used to be a researcher, did my graduate school in Toronto, came out to the Bay, worked in corporate research in a whole bunch of fields from like solid state physics to like machine learning, package design, all sorts of stuff before I switched to tech in the tens, I think.
Amazing. And what about you, Irene?
Um, well, as Preet mentioned, we I met at Twitter, and I think we started having conversations about Eliza shortly after I relocated to the Bay Area. I think early last year. My background is largely in building tools and systems that enable other people to work more effectively. My background is in organizational psychology, and I generally leverage that around building data products. But I think one of the things that really resonated with me when Pradeep was talking about his passion for therapy was its alignment with my own um, volunteer work, right? Like I've spent a fair bit of work volunteering with veterans who have PTSD, volunteering with uh, backcountry first responders and teaching them like field de escalation skills. And so I have a little bit of a sympathy for the patient side of things, I think. And when he was like, we really want to improve access to care and really support people with mental health struggles, and I think the best way to do that is in supporting the therapists who treat them. It really resonated, I think. So yeah, I think that's kind of how we came together.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's like one theme I hear it here is that sort of deep background in research, analytics, data, but also a big empathy for the field of psychotherapy and support and mental health that kind of brought you guys together in a way. So that's amazing. Um, so What would you say is sort of your each one of the reason to choosing to found Eliza? You know, when startups are a risky proposition in the first place, and with your backgrounds, you definitely had some other options in the space. So, what made you kind of take this leap and find your own company?
Yeah, I think for myself, there's both a personal journey as well as the affinity that you called out to the domain. um Kind of starting maybe backwards there, I honestly, I think it just starts with my own therapist. I think I've heard him in a number of sessions talk about a lot of the challenges here, and it also when I think you honestly don't need to spend a lot of time even doing research. You just the media kind of already highlights a lot of the tensions and a lot of the challenges that exist in the space, and so it just seemed like a natural fit for me. The mental health provider space. On a personal level, I think one of the reasons a startup was right for me was just in my career arc. So I've been working at a number of large companies, and I worked. I had this great early kind of working relationship at a startup. It's called Brightroll, and we were acquired by Yahoo, and it was a very formative experience for me. I really appreciated the velocity, the ownership, the ability to really have your kind of like foot on the throttle, for lack of a better term, to affect whatever change you'd like. And as I've worked at large companies and small, I there's been a part of me ever since that formative experience that's really wanted to go back to founding, go back to an early stage. And when things wrapped up for me at Twitter, that was the perfect time. And I kind of had my eyes set on that.
Yeah. What
Um,
about you, Irene?
yeah, I think I, like Pradeep, I was ready for a change back to a smaller organization after being at Twitter and really, I think having a smaller team that I could be a little more closely knit with. Um, I will say that for me, choosing to found wasn't really a single moment in time. It was more of a continual process of consistently opting in and continually choosing to keep going or not, and being recommitted. And there were a lot of decision points along the way where I was like, um, we could quit or we could keep going, and you really had to find the dedication to like kind of keep going and be thoughtful about it. And I really tried to not let inertia drive me. um, and I think that it's easy. Pradeep is a very compelling person, and he's very good at conveying his ideas clearly. And I think that that made it really easy to have a clear lodestar, really, and for us to kind of communicate about what our objectives were, and that having a clear objective and um, having a direction, I think, is a big help in being committed to something, right? Because you know what direction you're going.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe, Irene, if you can kind of explain to our viewers a little bit how you took both of your vision and experience and passion for the space of mental health and kind of brought it into what Eliza is today. So, what does it look like in terms of your customers? What does the product do?
Yeah, so our customers are therapy clinics, and our users are therapists. And Eliza is a support tool for therapists. I think one of the things that really stood out to Pradeep and I as we started looking at the mental health market is how consistently therapists were saying two things. One is that I'm super burnt out by the amount of work that I have to do that isn't providing therapy. And the other one is that it is lonely. This is really lonely work, and it is very emotionally and cognitively challenging for me to feel like I'm constantly coaching other people through the hardest moments in their lives and not really knowing whether or not I'm doing a good job. And
Yeah.
I would like more feedback because I can't always tell. Um, and when we looked at what was happening in other markets that provide care, like surgery, we saw that doctors have a whole wealth of support teams, right? They have nurses, they have administrators, they have a whole bunch of faculties and resources that help them do things like continuously monitor whether or not their patients are getting better, how their patients are responding to treatments, how they're doing after surgery, and support teams that help them focus on where their talents really lie and kind of taking over the administrative burden for them and collaborating with them. And therapists, I think by the nature of their work and the fact that they're not working in in large teams, just
Right.
by virtue of the fact that it's a very one-on-one situation, don't have that benefit. And so we really focused on solving that specific problem, right? How can we give therapists the support and information that they need to um, focus on providing care and knowing that they're doing it well?
Yeah. They really need a support group, sort of a network around them, and in some degree, like a co-pilot to help them kind of navigate the patient care, and feel supported while they do it, so they can really focus on what's important, which is the
Yeah,
patient care and not the sort of paperwork and all the little things around that. But the other thing that I think is really important is to really get the feedback, right? It's not just like eliminating the paperwork, it's really understanding how well you're doing and how to kind of navigate forward so the treatment is most effective for the patient.
yeah, that's exactly right. If you go see your cardiologist and he prescribes Lipitor, like he can run a test that says, yes, your cholesterol has gotten better and this treatment is effective. Um, Tools like that are less readily available and less apparent in like the day-to-day practice of therapy. And so that's one of the conditions that we were really trying to change.
Yeah,
Yeah,
very,
that's a
very important.
that's a really great point. I think that Irene called out. I think early on, there's this whole process of problem discovery. I think in the super early stage, but early on, one of the things we came across was exactly this dichotomy of how, if you look at traditional medicine, Western medicine, you again, obviously there are a lot of faults and a lot of challenges, issues there when you talk about clinical research, but the application of clinical research as it trickles down into what your GP does or your cardiologist, in this example, there is a clear pipeline there. However, in psychotherapy and mental health more broadly, that's somewhat disconnected. And it seems, in fact, we had an advisor who was the former head of the California Psychological Association, and he was just very blunt. He said he's very Eliza for him was a like a critical initiative because he saw this camp of researchers doing amazing cutting edge work using a lot of modern technology that was completely disjointed, distinct, and cut off from what practitioners actually do. There was no pipeline. And
Yeah.
so his challenge, especially when he was heading up the California Psychological Association, was like, how can we bring modern practices? How can we bring, all these decades of active research, these hundreds of like thousands of researchers and their continual evolution of that domain to the practitioner? And that exists in medicine. Those skills, that whole pipeline exists there, but it doesn't here. And that was one of the kind of rallying cries we had with Eliza is, hey, we can bring technology here to help solve this problem. Historically, because of the very subjective nature, perceived, I would argue, subjective nature of therapy, folks would just eschew that, say it's not possible, you couldn't do that. But I think this is the benefit of LLMs and a lot more NLP technology that we have access to today, that you can actually make a lot of the subjective content much more measurable, much more quantitative. And that's kind of the more specific set of tools that we try and provide therapists with.
Yeah, absolutely. I think about like other areas when you think about like sentiment analysis, which is very
Hmm.
prevalent, of course, on social media.
Hmm.
This really talks about feelings and emotions and look at huge data sets to make sense of something that's qualitative and turn it into a quantitative situation. So if you can do it on social networks to understand where people are thinking and where their minds are at, certainly you can go and do that in the healthcare or mental health care practice to better understand, the progress of treatment and how is the patient doing with the course of action.
Absolutely. And it's actually a little amusing. The sentiment analysis one is a great was a moment of like maybe amusing sadness. I'm sure there's a German word for that. But amusing
We're
sadness on my
wrong
part.
word for that, probably.
Indeed. Because I remember early on trying to use some of the off-the-shelf kind of like sentiment analysis models and sentiment analysis data sets. And of course, they're all trained for e-commerce or like product review settings. And they, of course, do very poorly on in mental health applications. Often it's rare that you talk about product returns or
Mhm.
defects in a therapy situation.
Right.
So the dichotomy here of how underserved the therapist community is from a technological perspective is shocking. What's actually one of those early shocks that I think we experience and as a both individually and as a company.
Yeah, absolutely. So the idea, the concept of using, machine learning to understand sentiment works great, but the existing tools in the market really don't fit the paradigm in that space. So you really need to like reinvent what it means to use NLP and sentiment analysis and all those tools to analyze that in context of the practice. And that makes
Exactly.
sense because it's very nuanced and maybe kind of the type of conversations and challenges that people bring up is very different than what you see on social media. So that makes a lot of sense. And it really speaks to the innovation that you guys are bringing into the space. Well, speaking about innovation in that space, let's shift gears to talk a little bit about risk taking because going in and venturing into founding a new company is risky, and certainly in certain spaces it's more. So, how do you kind of think about risk, and how do you work together as co-founders to navigate the potential challenges and maybe opportunities when taking risks?
Yeah. Um, I mean, I think it's worth calling out that Pradeep and I have very different um, risk preference profiles, right? Like, I don't think either of us is entirely adverse to risk, but we're definitely adverse to different kinds of risks.
Hmm.
And I think that's something that really works well for us because it gives us a good way to kind of counterbalance each other and play devil's advocate and really kind of interrogate our decisions. I think that um, we really try and be open about evaluating decisions and seeing them as risky. And so we try and include a discussion about uh, what all of the gains are going to be, and that includes learning from failure. I think a lot of the things that we learned uh, early on, in particular, didn't come from successes, and that was really valuable for us and was an important part of our development and growth process. Um, we also, I think, developed an ethic of trying to do risky things in the most conservative way possible, right? It was very apparent that venturing into the mental health field had the potential um, to change things and really to have big implications, both positive and negative. And we really wanted to take on that challenge, but we wanted to do it um, with a really conservative lens, right? And be focused and thoughtful about that. And then we really try and be mindful of sunk costs when we evaluate risks, right? Like the past is the past, and we're making a decision about the future, and that was a really important framing for us. Um, and then I think the last thing is that we tried to be open about the difference between our logical assessment of the risks and what the costs actually were, and kind of our emotional sensitivity to it, and maybe this perception of scarcity um, or uh, damage to our own ego or our perception of the world or whatever, and what sort of loss was kind of evolved and where that was coming from. Pretty, what did I miss?
No, honestly, I was going to just maybe amplify a couple of things you said. I think you mentioned this thing around how we have, I think, different profiles,
Hmm.
like personally as people, around how we handle both to take risk and are risk averse. I think that's a really good point. And I'm just reflecting on like specific examples. I think one of the things where Whereas most pronouns, I think when you mentioned that came to mind, is around essentially like contractors and employees and such. I tend to be, give folks like a lot of feedback, a lot of chances, like let's try again and again and again. And that's maybe like great for like a larger company setting, but in a startup, that's not like we don't have the time and resources to really do that. So there's this whole thing we can like expound on, which is like what does like early stage startup hiring look like? What does that mean that there's a whole thing there? And I feel that this is an area where I would burn a lot more cycles, trying to like coach folks. And obviously there's a balance. Like you have to do those things. And this is where I feel that I've been able to learn a lot more from Irene. And then the meta here is honestly that the biggest risk, and this is like I think investors will mention this too, is the founding team. Like, and of course, from the investor side, I think they are not looking at these sorts of nuanced. How are Irene and Pradeep best match from like a risk perspective? They're maybe looking at it from like a different lens, but for as a founder, how other founders kind of like balance out your not just like technical like acumen or product acumen or whatever, but your decision making profile, how they help you collectively make better decisions is a huge piece. Honestly, like I don't know if there's a great way to do this short of having actually worked together before on some non-trivial projects, which I believe is one of the things investors look for. It's like have the co-founders all work together on something non-trivial before. Um, yeah, that's I think the like to me the founding team thing really sticks with me, and yeah, just de-risking a lot of that. The other piece that I think on the topic of risk is really just like the number one enemy is really time. um, I think, I mean, arguably that's
Yeah.
true in all situations,
Yeah.
but I think in early stage startups, there's not a lot of capital, there are not a lot of resources, like in terms of people. So you just have to like that. What that translates to is just time. Like you don't have time to do things. So how many shots on goal can you get in that finite time? Like how often can you fail? And this goes back to kind of what Irene was calling out. Is just hey, you can't have much ego on what you build. You got to be willing to throw away some stuff. And like again, like a concrete, a tangible example here is I remember how I had a mental model for how therapists should work rather than how they want to work. And
Well, that's a big pitfall in product development in general,
absolutely,
right?
and
You're
absolutely, and it's
not
very
your
deceiving.
customer.
And like of course, if you ask me, it's like yes, I know that principle. Like this is how you should pay attention to how they want to do it. But it's very, in the thick of it and fog of war, as it were, it's very hard to recognize that because you're not getting perfect signal from any of your customers. No one's telling you like this is not how it like such and such. So, and it's easy to just see that bias come out. And honestly, it's calendaring. And part of that is just literally, I just personally just hate building calendaring solutions. I just hate it. It's just annoying. It's just like not sexy in any way for me. And so I just hate it. But that's what the therapist needed. They're just like, I just need a calendar thing to be able to augment the sort of like so I can have sessions. I can be like, here's the session that's happening. Here's like, I can do some of that basic management on your platform to be able to unlock all these features. And it just took me a while to kind of see that. And like that cost us shots on goal. And
Yeah.
that's not great. And this goes back to also the founding team thing, which I think I remember a few times Aaron being like, maybe you need to build a calendar. And yeah, and I was yeah.
Yeah, because you guys are in any venture, but specifically in the space you've decided to kind of go into, as you so thoughtfully articulated, there are no solutions. There isn't like a blueprint, and you're walking uncharted territory, and really trying to understand how to help folks who are also navigating very sensitive and high
Hmm.
stakes situations. And I think to your guys' point, you got to be very humble about it, both in the sense of like what are the customers are, what's the problem? What did they really need? What does that look like? And potentially we're not going to nail in the first or second or third time, because it's going to be an iterative process, getting feedback, seeing what works, and really trying it out. And that's the big piece, right? You mentioned like you need to embrace failing and moving on, because that failure have taught you something, which is this did not work, but maybe something else could be more appropriate. And the only way to know it is you try it, right? So that makes a lot of sense. And I think specifically in this space, I would say even more so, you know, that need to be humble could be really critical. And I think the other piece about, both of you as founders, I think having like two different perspectives really augments your superpower. If you were the same, you would go into group thinking. Having those two different
Mm.
perspectives really help you to sort of booster your own capabilities and challenge each other. So I think that's a big piece of navigating risk. And then that goes to our next topic, which, we have spoken about this space to be, sensitive and not easy, and as in all medical fields, regulated. So how do you guys think about the risk in this space, and how are you navigating that?
Yeah, mental health is a really hard market. And we, I, we faced early on kind of the decision for whether or not we were going to build a product that engaged with the patient side of things, or a product that engaged with the therapeutic relationship. And, part of engaging with the therapeutic relationship meant that we had to be ready to bear the cost of compliance, that we had to take on regulatory risk, that we had to be willing to manage a much more complicated and sophisticated set of stakeholders, in that we had to meet the needs and the concerns of not just the patient, and not just the therapist, but also of the clinics in which they work, and the regulatory structure that they're kind of beholden to, that's like providing their credentials and overseeing their work. Um, and so I, it was, we decided to engage with the therapeutic relationship, and not with the patients. I, in part because it gave us a framework for safety to kind of leverage and help us ensure that we were doing things with integrity and doing things in a way that genuinely met people's need, because we walked into this kind of existing framework that was already built around all of those concerns. Um, and yeah, I think that that was kind of the the ethic that we took to uh, to engaging in this market. And one of the things that we found when we got there is that therapists and clinics had been faced with a lot of neglect, right? There are a lot of tools out there that kind of exist for them that had been repurposed from medical settings that weren't necessarily particularly germane to their work specifically. They had had a lot of like technological heroes who came in and were like, we understand everything about what you do, and we have the solution for you. Here you go. And we had to work really hard to earn all of their trust and really kind of overcome that history. Um, yeah, Preet, what do you think?
Yeah, yeah, large cosign. I think to kind of add on like some of my observations, and Irene was really at the forefront of a lot of this. Like she was like I think the front line, kind of dealing with a lot of this stuff with our therapists and advisors. Um, the one going back to like the dichotomy of kind of traditional Western medicine and mental health, therapists aren't using much technology in their practice. Like their most advanced tool is generally something like Google Calendar,
Mm-hmm.
or like some platform that's essentially a wrapper equivalent to like Google Calendar with like notes. So as a consequence, like if you're now going in and trying to say like, hey, we're gonna do one ambient recording, Two, we're going to help with clinical decision support. We're going to help with treatment planning. We're going to do all these things to help you kind of better manage and better provide care to your patient cohorts. That's it's just that's just like orders of magnitude farther away than what they're
Yeah.
used to today, and that in and of itself requires some education and can bring a lot of concerns. The space, at the time that we were entering, there was certainly a number of these kind of like more admin tools, I would say. And, we're very much more of a clinical tool, but those admin tools, they, like, if you look at things like creating notes, those admin tools had this, had built a bit of a reputation for some of our therapists as
Mhm.
either being kind of like subpar, being a little risky or dangerous. And some of these tools that were being bandied around were just kind of like some thin wrapper around kind of OpenAI or something like that.
Yeah.
So there were a lot of hallucinations, a lot of stuff coming up. Therapists weren't sure how the data was going to be used, and so yeah, that was a large concern. I think the incumbent thinking, the expression, in fact, I think we heard this from a couple of therapists, is this move fast, break things. That's great. I mean, as conceptually maybe, but devil's in the details. And this person was like, yeah, well, you can't break things here, right? You can't
Yeah.
move fast, and like
It's
that's not a
really
great
nice when you're
modality.
building a social network. Well, some might argue even there is dangerous, but certainly when you're talking about something that impacts a person's life and well-being.
Exactly that. That's exactly that. And I think there's a sequence of conversations like this that fundamentally highlighted two like macro themes that really shaped our go-to-market. The first one is this is a feels like problem for our ICP. They feel like they're like there's essentially some fear and apprehension around adopting new technologies because they're concerned about how it's going to affect and impact their patient relationship. And so that's a thing we need to like essentially tackle and overcome. The second piece of that really, which I think is really a statement of how it affected our go to market, is you've got to eat the elephant here a little bit. So unlike some of these tools I called out earlier that were essentially, hey, here's like a quick tool, some notes, something, something, it creates something. If you want to build trust, there's no quick solution. You need to do a lot of work. And as a company, so are you HIPAA compliant? Do you follow security practices? Are those transparent? Are those like auditable? What is your like data handling policy? How are you training data? All this stuff. You can't just, move fast, break things
To
in
wing
this
it.
space as much.
Yeah. And I
So
think
Yeah.
yeah, and I think there's a couple of things that, we talked earlier about, well, there's like, sentiment analysis and NLP, but that does not work in the practice. There's tools for, a medical professional, but, mental health practice is different. You can't really import it. So it sounds like, maybe there's some solutions that are like and can work in other spaces, but you can't just take them and deploy them on this space. You really need to think how to modify them to your settings and the specific needs of the mental health
absolutely.
care practice.
Absolutely. And in
Yeah.
fact, the dichotomy, I was personally shocked by the dichotomy between like a doctor and their willingness to try a lot of new tools versus the therapist. And I think this, like, I chalk that up to, again, just this difference in how they've been historically served by technology.
Mhm.
Whereas doctors are accustomed to this, they're accustomed to a lot of new tools being provided for them, so they're much
Yeah,
more keen to say, like, yes, I'm going to go and like pick that up. A good example is a psychiatrist who is a medical doctor.
right.
And the way conversations we've had with them around technology have been starkly different than the ones we've had with therapists on this axis. So yeah,
Yeah.
and
So
that's
if you're perceived as the main ICP, as the main customer, and all eyes on you, and you get the tools you need, you feel trust. If
mhm.
you're kind of getting, I don't want to say leftovers, but if you're getting something that was developed to another persona, and someone says, well, it worked there, it probably worked for you, then you don't trust it as much because, running on the ground, it may not be as helpful, or might even, like, take more of your time or create challenges for you. And that's not really a great experience. So that really speaks to the fact that there's like many different personas, and even slight differences can mean different needs and different requirements for you. And that kind of brings me to another topic, because we talked a bunch about like product related things. But what is the kind of your core paradigm and principle in guiding you in the product? We've heard a little bit in just now, but what is those things that you can distill for us?
Yeah, we decided early on to really just be like completely obsessed with our customer, with our user. And that really meant that we spent, I can't even count how many hours, not just talking to customers and talking to therapists and experts and kind of our advisors, but also doing a bunch of background research on what their education looked like, what curriculums they were being subjected to, and kind of differences in cohorts, right? What does it look like if you graduated from your training 30 years ago as opposed to 2 years ago? And how has that evolved for you over time? Um, and I think I, you know, one of the things that, I guess, going back to a point that Pradeep made earlier, one of the differences that this made early for us is that it was a really long time between the time that we first engaged with customers and the time that we first had them bringing patients on the platform. And it was because we spent so much time with our early design partners doing all of that front loaded work to make sure that we had built a system that was really safe and trustworthy, but also um, helped them feel like they were safe and like it was worthy of their trust, and that that was something that they could genuinely go to their patients and say, yeah, like um, this is a system that we're willing to engage with. um, I think that I they cared a lot less about whether or not it was cool, and fancy and like had all of these cool AI solutions behind it, and whether or not it was like reliable and something that if they used it over and over again, that it was something that would give them really consistent results, because that is what you're actually looking for when you're looking at clinical decision support in any sort of uh, care application.
Yeah. I mean, that's a big piece, right? Because one of your goals is to help them to understand how they're making progress. In order to do that, you need to have that consistency in the system, and that reliability. And I think, listening to some of the things that you mentioned maybe about other tools, I mean, it sounds like really digging into what the customers need here is a big differentiator. It's a big competitive advantage, because that's what's going to make it or break it if they're going to adopt and feel it's something that they can trust and really bring that value for them. And it's sort of, you know, almost built for them by them because of the deep customer research and thought partnership that you've done early on to really shape the product in a way that will be helpful for them in their own life. Um, so, with that, I want to move forward to talk a little bit about technology, because we talked a lot about the human, about, the challenges and the problems. And we talked about risk, strategic risk. What about technological risk? So, how do you kind of take the project from 0 to 1? What are the biggest kind of costs and areas of uncertainty? And how do you evaluate those trade off and discuss it together, so you can build a solid technological process, but also move fast because you're still learning, right? You're still evolving.
Yeah, honestly, I think this is part of the art of not to suggest that I'm by any means like an expert at it, but like I think this is part of the art of like an early stage company. I think the biggest challenge is I mean it's just that you're both discovering the problem while also discovering a solution to match with that.
Yeah.
And that is the problem from a technology perspective. So what this means is that at least very brass tacks, the way I've approached this is the assumption that what I'm going to build, I'm going to probably throw away, or I'm going to have to like substantially refactor something. So what that means is like we're going to use a lot of off-the-shelf building blocks wherever it's possible,
Yeah.
to try and first like try and get that scaffolding around the problem you're discovering, and then once there's actually a clear direction, then you can start kind of building a more sure-footed foundation. And like that I think that's maybe like I've spoken to a few other founders, technical founders, and that like it's a very similar kind of like meta approach. The challenge there is, again, like the shots on goal analogy is something that I index on a lot. And how can you, on the engineering side, kind of set it up so that within a sprint, every sprint generates learning moments, and I think that's essential. So, and honestly, I think it's not even it can't even just be one. Like you can't just be like, here's one thing I learned in a sprint at the super early stage. It should be like some sort of like shotgun blast. Like you've learned like a whole bunch of things, and maybe they're imprecise. Maybe there's yeah, maybe it could have been better, but it's more important that you learn a lot every sprint until you start building that foundation, and then as you continue to evolve that that product, that then maybe you can get a lot more specific. Um, and so in communicating that, I think like at least between like Irene and myself, it's always that trade-off on time. It's just like, well, you can do A and it's going to take this much time, or you can do B. And the best example of this to make it more tangible is around a lot of the security stuff, or a lot of the compliance stuff, how you handle data. You can be compliant to all regulatory standards, but still occupy a position that's a lot more privacy preserving,
Right.
because that's a choice, and there's that has implications in how you position the product, implications in how you, to those therapist trust concerns we talked about earlier. But that could mean, I think in our example, that it was just like, hey, that's going to maybe add 4 weeks. So that's, if we're running a weekly sprint, that's 4 sprints where before you get any signal, that's pretty risky. So do you like what information, what signal did you have from previous sprints that that is what you have to do? And if you don't have to do it, you probably shouldn't do it at the super early stages, is I think how we approach it too. So those are some of the challenges there. And of course, in this space specifically, we use a combination of like there's some traditional NLP techniques, and then there are also like LLMs we use. LLM technology has just been evolving rapidly. And as a consequence, you're kind of building a foundation that's on top of moving ground.
Right.
Um, um, yeah, and so that creates its own challenges and complexities. If you're using middleware, like what do you do with middleware? Like, are you picking the right horse, for lack of a better term? There are a number of middleware options. As things evolve, one may have more community support. You're gonna have to re-platform. That's gonna
There's
burn
also a
sprint
various costs
cycles.
of all this data that's being processed that you kind of need to take into account. And would you really want to invest in one versus another, as every week you get those new models come out in the market?
Exactly, exactly. And so I think those are some of the challenges. I would say, luckily, my observation is the like technology community around at least LLMs right from the get-go got was a lot more cognizant of these sorts of challenges, and middleware started to show up very early on to allow essentially vertical AI companies like ourselves to be able to be a lot more flexible, a lot more agnostic to underlying infrastructure. Again, everything has trade-offs, but yeah, that's been a great boon, I think, for the community at large.
Yeah. So, I mean, it sounds like there's areas where like are really, really important, like compliance. And there you kind of need to understand what is really at this point is what you need. And then the other space of things that move very fast, compliance may not move so fast, but it could be really big and costly. And then there's other space of like things that move really fast, like, ML models, where you kind of need to figure out what's the right take for you. So you're making progress, but also like not left with something that's old in a day because a new model came out. And that is actually a great segue for the next point, because we kind of dance around ML and NLP and hallucinations and risk. But let's kind of talk a little bit about using AI and a platform for shaping mental health, and what does that mean if how you think and address that? How do you make sure it's safe?
Yeah. So I think for us, there are a few things, right? The first is that um, our users and our customers, and I think to an even greater extent, often the regulators, are not fully aware or sophisticated enough to understand what technological risks are, right? And so there's a lot of um, kind of invisible risks that we have to be aware of for them, and like honestly, just be willing to be ethical and like be upfront about taking care of those. Um, I think that one of the things that we heard from customers was not at all around the use of AI or LLMs or machine learning. Um, right? That wasn't the biggest thing at all. The biggest thing was uh, what is happening with our data?
Yeah.
How are things being stored? How are things being private? How um, is this going to be safe for all of my patients in the future? And that extends to um, a lot of different things, right? What happens if I get subpoenaed? What happens if you get subpoenaed and someone tries to compel you to give up my patient records? That was a very real concern that a number of our therapists brought up. But it was also stuff like, how are you making sure that there's a high fidelity of information so that there's not ever going to be a catastrophic failure that means that my patient records are wiped out, because that's also a risk. In terms of the risks of AI and machine learnings and LLM in particular, um, I think I one of the concerns that we heard early and often um, from people was like this fear that AI was going to replace therapy for patients, and that it was going to impact the way that the patients kind of engaged with their therapist. And I think a lot of that was mitigated just by having a very therapist first perspective on thing, and making sure that they were very involved in how we implemented the technology, and that they understood where it was touching their practice and where it wasn't. And then I think that some of the other places where our expert advisors were really concerned about uh, the way that these tools could impact the degradation of clinical skills, um, that it could introduce or reinforce bias in treatment, and that there would be a lack of transparency in AI supported evaluations and recommendations, and that potential impact on patient outcomes. And I think that one of the things that that really gets to is the importance of equity in how care is provided, right? We've seen these same kinds of things come up in the past in medical treatment, and that's not always equitable. Um, and so we really tried to thoughtfully address each of these risks um, by doing things like addressing the potential risk to the degradation of clinical skills, by building in features that supported therapists introspecting and reflecting on the therapy that they had provided, which we were told by clinical trainers and clinical supervisors was one of the biggest things that allowed therapists to move forward with treatment and to really learn and evolve as therapists professionally. We really worked closely with our therapists and with our advisors to make sure that we understood not just how therapists are practicing on a day-to-day basis, but what the fundamental practice of therapy meant in terms of mitigating bias, and how to be aware of and really test for that. Um, and then frankly, like uh, we used well well respected and well regarded models. Like there's a fairly standard set of questions that you've probably taken at your doctor's office called the PHQ-9 that helps assess whether or not you have depression. And those are validated, they're transparent, they're well understood by professionals in this field. And that was our basis for developing tools. And we were very careful to align around those existing tools to kind of preserve transparency and give therapists something that they could translate and apply their own skill set too, right? To say like, yeah, I get that that's kind of what you're saying, but it doesn't apply in this way because I know something that the machine doesn't. Um, and I think, yeah, that was, we addressed the technological risk by being really close to our patients in the way that they carry out their work.
Yeah. So there's two things kind of, there's a lot of different things, but one of the things I'm hearing is when possible, use that sort of tried and truth, standardize elements and incorporate it into the AI. And I think the other thing is making the tool helpful for the therapist in their own growth, right? So they don't feel they're just like, oh, like putting something, getting an output and just implying it to the patient rather than it helps them to think through better what are the options, how have they come to a conclusion that that's the right course of action, and helping them to better do their work in their own sort of way, in ways they would usually do outside of the world of AI.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. And I think that that really kind of goes back to our first principles and being focused on our goals, right? Like our objective was to help therapists provide um, more and more effective care to their patients. And like just staying incredibly focused on that as our objective allowed us to make decisions around um, how to implement features that were helping them and kind of assessing what the costs of those features were to the way that they actually carried out their work.
Yeah. Is it
One of the
is it replacing or is it empowering? Is the question. Yeah. Sorry, Purdy.
No, no, not at all. One of the things that this has me reflecting on is kind of like the early days as we kind of went through problem discovery,
Mm,
and trying to figure out what to do here, essentially. Um, that I think talks to like the safety challenge is the focus we have around therapists as opposed to patients. So I think part of safety, from my perspective, you can make the like safety is some sort of interaction perhaps between the product and its customer, and maybe it's a screwed mental model. So you have two pieces there that you can tweak, potentially. And so the first one is what we did with the audience, like who is the target customer. So if you are now providing a product directly to kind of end patients, that's going to have a very different safety implication. And there are a number of folks who are trying to do that. And this is where now you are essentially, in some sense, competing with a therapist, and you need to then meet kind of human care standards set up at the FDA, so on and so forth. And that's just from a product perspective, just a very different burden. And so for us, again, kind of to the point that Irene called out, orienting around the value we want to provide to therapists, not competing with them, they became our our customer, and as a consequence, safety changes a lot, because they are essentially mediating. Look, we're trying to help them, and we're not involved directly in providing care to the patient. And what that means is that safety for our product really becomes a question of like, is Eliza valuable or effective for the therapist?
yeah.
Which is much more of a traditional kind of like product problem than one of like, oh, are you like hallucinating, or are you generating a lot of false positives, so on and so forth. And so I think that that's a big piece here as well, is like, can you reframe the product or reframe the space or customers in this example, so that the safety issues become far less pronounced.
Yeah. So like, what is the success measure here? What's the overarching tool or measure that you're looking to see? Is it providing value? Um, yeah.
Exactly.
And absolutely. And I think kind of maybe last point around, topic of like product and risk and um, how do you define innovation in this space? Or what is
Mm.
innovation in the space of mental health?
Yeah, that's a good question. I I feel that, um on one hand, because like therapists are just so poorly supported by technology, there's many things are honestly just highly innovative. I think I was ragging on my distaste of calendaring solutions, but even just building a coherent calendaring solution was like hugely appreciated in a way. Obviously, it wasn't just a calendar, but just like the whole workflow that we built around that and this. But because that was like that has actually accounted for how a therapist wants to work and the entire life cycle of the day. And so in a way that's like there's just the orientation around the customer just naturally generates a lot of innovation. Um, but like in a very brass tacks way, I'm actually in a way very reluctant to innovate. Meaning that I kind of have to be forced into doing it to solve a problem because I think it is very risky. I mean, it's risky. We talked about kind of like the various like domain specific risks, the product risk, technology risk, the time. And so I just don't want to do it unless I really have to. We've also touched upon how all these components translate into go-to-market risk. So it's yeah. So this is a piece where my default position is why couldn't you just use some solution A or solution B, something off the shelf? Why do I need to like build something and spend effort doing something? And yeah, and finding that goes back to problem discovery again.
Yeah. And if you find an area that's really, really unmet, then that's the place you tap into. So let's talk a little bit about go to market, because we have spoken about all the nuances and maybe the baggage the therapist may have in the past. So how does it shape your go to market in general? And then me also specifically, how do you even think about pricing in that
Mm,
space?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we touched on this a little bit earlier and pretty kind of talked about the way that some of the choices that we made impacted our go-to-market. I think that one of the ways in which the mental health care space kind of differs from certainly from some of our experiences and from, I think, just technology in general, is the complexity of the relationship between the product and the market itself, right?
Mhm.
Because it is both very much a feels like problem, but there are also very real, just tactical problems that also have to be solved. And, um, because this is a regulated and for profit industry, there are also real economic and regulatory concerns. And so we, in going to market, had to kind of overcome barriers to adoption from patients, from individual care providers, from clinics. And that meant that we had to plan our go to market strategy to address the needs of all three. And at times we had to prioritize them and say, like, you know what, we're not going to care right now about what clinics need. We're going to focus entirely on what the therapist needs. We're going to build trust there. We're going to work on them first. And um, that's where we're going to focus. And then we're going to evolve later. And it had very different um, outcomes for our product than I think if we had started from the clinic perspective and then backed into assuming the therapist was going to be our user because the clinic was ultimately driving the decision and was
Yeah.
foisting this tool on their therapists. Um, yeah, pretty, I guess. But
yeah, I'm just trying to reflect a little bit on that. I think honestly you kind of captured like the main points like really well. We we started like I think part of the challenge for us in the go to market is the decision maker and the end user aren't necessarily the
Yeah.
same
That's
thing.
a big point.
And so and especially since we're trying to build a product too, you kind of need the end user's input to really build a compelling product. But ultimately, the decision maker, like a clinic supervisor, is the one who's gonna kind of like make a call, and obviously they'll have the end user. So there's a little bit of like an enterprise sales motion here, effectively,
Yeah.
but simultaneously not. This is not an enterprise. Like small to mid-sized clinics are not enterprise entities, and like they don't have that sort of rigor and sales process. So yeah, so the go-to-market is had this like weird shift, and that's why we started with like this the single shingle kind of go-to-market, because that's like easy, it's understandable, you get clear feedback and signal on how to evolve the product. And then, but that's not where we wanted to remain. That's not, honestly, like the economics of a product like Eliza, or an offering that we want to first be a venture scale business, doesn't quite fully exist purely in the single shingle space. And so, and that leap is what needed to happen. And so there was a little bit of a crawl, walk, run there. Honestly, still being refined, still being figured out.
Right.
Yeah, I think one of the product analogies that we came back to and kind of used to pattern our own behavior against was Figma, who, like in a very different space, kind of had a similar problem in that like designers are their users, but they're not going to pay for like the whole thing, right? And so we kind of looked a little bit at like what they had done, like yeah, that seems clever. Let's follow that. And there are a few other good examples, kind of adjacent.
Yeah, because in a way, you're absolutely right. You're working in a somewhat enterprise